You are listening to the We Need to Talk About Oscar podcast, and this is our interview with Ian McDonald, the screenwriter of Anna Kendrick's directorial debut, Woman of the Hour, now available to watch on Netflix.
I think feel-bad movies are designed to get at some truth. And even though on the surface, seeing something like No Country for Old Men, say, which is kind of relentlessly sad throughout, I wouldn't go so far as to call it a pessimistic film, but it's very bleak. It's getting at an underlying truth, which is that the world feels at times chaotic and indifferent to us. And the only way to kind of move past those feelings is to engage with them.
As far as I know, you write for stage as well. But there is this question we like to start our interviews with, which is basically asking our guests about their core memories of not even how they got into filmmaking, but how they first fell in love with films. So, what's your story?
Oh, gosh. I feel like I should have a really good answer for that. Truth is, when I was really little, I like my earliest memory was watching. Did you ever see that movie, The Never-Ending Story?
No. Should I?
It's good. It's good. It's like a Wolfgang Peterson movie. It's a kid's fantasy film, and there's a scene in it where basically a horse drowns in quicksand, and I was like gutted. I was just ruined by that movie. I was like 5 or 6 years old, and I only vaguely knew that like there were people who made movies, that it wasn't just a thing that was happening in front. Yeah. But I did know, and I remember at the time thinking like, what sociopath would think this was fun to watch? Like I was just like, what, like, because I also know it was a kid's movie, and yet at the same time, it stayed with me for years after that. And so, like, honestly, that's probably the first movie I saw that had a really deep emotional impact on me. And, but in terms of like, wanting to pursue it beyond that, it was probably more like junior high, or like when I was like, 13, 12, something like that. And I started watching, when I was a kid, my dad, he loved movies, and every year he would check in with my mom to be like, is he old enough to see The Godfather now? And she's just like, no, he's 9, like give it a year, and I turned a certain age and she said yes. And so he showed me like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and The Godfather and John Carpenter's The Thing and like all these wonderful movies. And it was this real eye opener for me, like, oh my God, it can be anything. And I sort of fell in love with it after that.
I mean, who would want you to see a horse drown in quicksand? But who would want to watch movies about serial killers, right?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. That's kind of where I started. But like, it's something I think about a lot is what is the point of a movie that's designed to make you feel bad? Because I do think they're useful, and I think they're cathartic. And ultimately, I think feel-bad movies are designed to get at some truth. And even though on the surface, seeing something like No Country for Old Men, say, which is kind of relentlessly sad throughout, I wouldn't go so far as to call it a pessimistic film, but it's very bleak. It's getting at an underlying truth, which is that the world feels at times chaotic and indifferent to us. And the only way to kind of move past those feelings is to engage with them. And to engage with them through art seems like a really kind of healthy, productive thing to do. And so if a movie is kind of a bummer of a film, well, it can nevertheless make you realize like, oh, I'm not an alien. I'm not alone in this world. Other people have felt these feelings too. And conversely, that can be very cathartic. I mean, You're in Hungry, Bellatar is the king of this, Yeah. Like, I mean, I watched The Turin Horse and I'm just like, I walk out of that feeling cleansed somehow, even though the movie is intensely sad.
Fascinating. I mean, couldn't have said it better, truly. The script for Woman of the Hour appeared on the blacklist back in 2017, if I'm correct.
Mm-hmm.
Just last week or the week before, I listened to a real good interview with the site's founder, Franklin Leonard. And one of his more interesting claims was the fact of how statistically, just by the numbers, it's harder for a script to be produced than, for example, being one of those who gets drafted into the NFL or the NBA. And I'm not going to ask you what you think is special about this script, but has there been feedback from others trying to point out what the reason for this specific script getting produced might be?
I mean, to be totally honest, I've heard that same thing too. I think there's probably some truth to it. You know, one likes to think that they've written something that speaks to producers, it speaks to readers. And yet at the same time, if I'm being honest with myself, a huge part of it is just luck. You know, this movie almost died like 4 times, 5 times, something like that. It came really, really close. I've had other movies that got really, really close and then did die. And it's not because those scripts weren't as good as this script. It's just because the stars didn't align, you know? And so I think filmmakers and screenwriters in particular have to be really humble because there's a lot of great writers out there and there's a lot of great screenplays out there that'll never see the light of day. And it doesn't mean they're not good scripts. It means that this particular actor didn't want to do this particular movie at exactly this time, or some other producer who would have been perfect to do it just so happened to sign on to another movie that's a little bit similar a week beforehand, and now they don't want this thing anymore. There's talent involved, there's hard work involved, but there's a lot of luck.
What did your involvement look like in the making of the movie after the script was acquired, or I don't know?
I mean, honestly, it was mostly just working with Anna to develop it, you know, because each time a new producer or a new director comes on, they have their own notes and their own thoughts. And, you know, and the way a screenwriter can best serve the project as a whole is to make sure that the movie that's being made, not that it serves the filmmaker exactly, like everyone has to be on the same page and agree that they're making the same movie. But like if the writer and the director are kind of at odds or at cross purposes, then the movie's going to feel sort of muddy. And Anna came in with a very clear and specific vision for how she wanted the movie to be. And so it was developing it with her and kind of figuring out what that actually looked like. There were weird technical things that I wound up doing once the movie went into production. Like, you know, we had a very, very tight shooting schedule. And so, you know, all the dating game stuff, Anna basically said, could you write this as though it's a 1-act play, like with all the scenes back to back, so I can just shoot it in one fell swoop? Because there was no other way to do it scheduling wise. And so then it's like recompiling the script and reorganizing it in a way where it can be shot, given the limitations of the schedule. But other than that, there wasn't a whole lot. I was only on set for 1 day because of COVID restrictions and things like that.
And how did the script evolve from 2017 to the one based on which the film was shown in Toronto last year?
Yeah, so there's the kind of A storyline and the B storyline, and the A storyline is basically Cheryl's character. You know, she's a struggling actress in Hollywood, and she's trying to get noticed, and so she agrees to be on this TV show, The Dating Game. And there she meets Rodney, and then they have this encounter after the fact. And that more or less has stayed the same since 2017. What's really changed has been the B storyline, because Rodney victimized a lot of people. We kind of went back and forth in terms of which of these stories to include, because depending on which ones you include, it can alter the themes of the piece, or it can impact the level of darkness or the kind of darkness. And then you have to decide what kinds of narratives, what kinds of micro narratives are serving the larger narrative. And so it was things like that. You know, Rodney had victims who were children. And so for a while we had included stuff like that, you know, worried that like if you take it out, you risk whitewashing the movie. But at the same time, it felt thematically adjacent to what we were actually interested in, which is more like kind of dating culture, and when 2 adults agree to be intimate with one another, and that can not necessarily even be a date, but just like to engage with somebody else is very different than engaging with a kid. And so it just felt adjacent to that. So things like that were things that got changed along the way.
And regarding Anna's involvement in bringing your script to life, how did all this come about, as her directing the film and then deciding on starring in it, or first starring and then directing, or the two together?
Yeah, so she started out as a signing on to act in the project, and she was attached for about 2 years as an actor. And at first it was going to be made with one studio, and then that fell apart, and then it was going to be made with another studio. And like 6 weeks before we were going to go into pre-production, we lost our director to just a scheduling conflict. She couldn't do it. And I thought the movie had finally died for good, that it was all over. And then Anna raised her hand and said, you know what, I think I'd actually like to direct this. And so in that way, she saved the movie. It just wouldn't have happened without her.
That's incredibly brave. I mean,
Yeah.
For a debut feature to just jump in like that.
And with such little time, too, that's the other thing. She had to make a lot of really big decisions very quickly.
It's a so confidently directed movie. Crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, she did a great job.
And the film is based on a true story.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks to this, it's so time specific, but with the aforementioned dating dynamics and all, at the same time, it can feel timeless. So in this case, where does history and facts end? And with that, fiction begins.
Yeah, so this was something Anna and I talked a lot about. And basically, whenever we fictionalize something, it was generally an attempt to include something true that had happened, or an experience that had happened where maybe there wasn't a clean place for it anywhere else in the narrative. So like I remember reading an interview with a family member of one of the victims who described he hadn't heard from his sister in a few days. And so he goes over to her apartment and he knocks on the door and she doesn't answer. And so then he has to get the landlord to open the door, and he goes inside and there's blood everywhere. In my research, I read a lot of stories from survivors, either friends or family members, who were just like, yeah, I remember seeing her go off with this guy and he was kind of creepy and I didn't trust him. But also it's just like, it's not really my place to tell her not to. And then they're haunted by that after the fact. And so like, we wanted that voice, we wanted that perspective to be in the movie. Now, in reality, there wasn't that character on the set of The Dating Game while he was recording it. That to us felt like the most economical placement of that voice, if that makes sense. We didn't want to have this full other narrative with other locations. It would just get too unwieldy. And so this is one of the things that makes screenwriting a really unique art form. Is in some ways it's almost more like writing a poem, like a haiku, where every word it all has to fit together. It's not a novel where you can just spread. And so when we talk about composite characters, for example, and you are still trying to tell the story, but it's easier for audiences to identify with one person than it is with maybe like 10 or 20, and so this one becomes a representative of a group. And so fiction in service of a kind of emotional truth. That was our goal.
You just mentioned the TV show, the whole recording of it, and there is this contrast created between Rodney and the two other guys. This is where we see where his true charm lies, and that's what to a point makes him even more creepier, like the psychopathic part of it. And that entire give and take between Cheryl and him and the other guys is I believe I can say, the most delicious part of the film to me. Just getting to see how quick she's on her feet and the way Anna delivers all that. I'd guess that to a point, even though you just told me how fiction came into all this, but the middle part of the film is what we actually might have somewhat of a footage of. How do you write about or along existing footage?
Well, see, it's tricky. So you can find footage online of Rodney asking questions to Cheryl, but there's no footage of the other bachelors. Okay.
Mhm.
So we had to make up all that. It just doesn't exist anywhere. And just to make it crystal clear, the two other bachelors in the show, those are totally fictitious representatives of whoever the real life people were. But one of the things that was tricky about that was that it's funny if you go back and you were to watch actual footage of Rodney's time on the dating game now, most people would be like, dude, that man's a creep. He is disgusting. He's weird. Like, run for the hills. Like, why on earth would you pick him? And in part, it's because social norms and etiquette have changed in the last 50 years. And so what we would now view as like kind of a creepy joke or like a weird off-putting comment back then was just funny, you know? And so if I was to transcribe his dialogue, like line for line as he originally spoke it, my concern is that modern audiences would be like, why is this woman still talking to this guy? She's an idiot. And she wasn't an idiot. She was a product of her time when some of those creepy jokes and like off-putting double entendres were considered fine. And so a lot of the revising of his dialogue in particular that we did was done to make sure that the audiences watching this movie on Netflix get to experience something like the emotional journey that she went on, you know, where she was kind of charmed by him and she thought he was kind of funny and he was saying the right things, not the wrong things. And so a lot of that was revised with the intention of putting modern audiences in Cheryl's shoes. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Last but not least, early in the film, we learn one of the ways Rodney lures his victims is by offering to take photos of unsuspecting women. There was actually a time I considered photography I was planning on photography to be more than just a hobby for me. My grandpa was a professional photographer, and I would offer to take pictures of people, though they were friends. And yeah, secondly, I'm not a serial killer, but which, yes, is exactly what a serial killer would say. But that's not the point. So my question is, has there ever been not even a character, but a trait or an action in a film that made you go or realize, oh no, that's just like me?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I don't know. Let me answer it backwards for a second. I mean, to get to what you were saying before, like, you know, there's this American playwright whose work I really love. He was a novelist for years. His name's Adam Rapp. He was a novelist for years. And I read this interview with him where someone said, why did you start writing plays? You were already a very successful novelist. And he's just like, you know, writing novels is very lonely. I thought if I wrote a good play, I'd be around actors and maybe I could meet a girl. And so, like, you know, pursuing art because you want to date, like, that's not weird. You know, that's not strange. It's being a serial killer and then doing that. That's the strange part. Yeah, no, I mean, you know, when I think of characters who, like, you know, I'm just like, oh, I feel seen or embarrassed in some way. There's like, did you ever see Barton Fink?
Yeah.
Yeah, so like that's one where it's just like I pride myself in being a good listener. But at the same time, I also know that I can be very long-winded where I should be talking, where I am talking when I should be listening. And, you know, he goes on and on about like the common man. And it's just like, you're a playwright living in Hollywood, writing a movie for studios. Like, you have lost touch, sir. And so I look at him as sort of a cautionary tale for all artists to not get too high and mighty and to have a real sense of humility about yourself and what you're working on. And so, like, yeah, that's a movie where I'm just like, I see myself and I don't necessarily love what I see.
Well, thank you for answering that, truly. And once again, thank you for your time, Ian. I loved chatting about this. I loved the movie. And I loved chatting with you as a whole. So
thank you. Yeah, no, the pleasure was all mine. I really, really appreciate it.